Welcome to a Whale Fest Monterey 2018. Welcome to our symposium. My name is Steve Elzy. I'm with Your Sanctuary TV. We make ocean conservation films. We are ready for another romp through marine research here, and this is just, it's been so fun, and it's just getting even better and better. So you picked a great one to be at or to stay at, and Dr. John Pearse is a professor emeritus from the University of California, Santa Cruz, right up the road. Obviously, still on Monterey Bay. And he taught at UCSC for over 25 years. And during that time, obviously, he was teaching and doing research and publish and everything else you have to do as a prof. And he was one of the first scientists to demonstrate the effect of seasonal day length changes in synchronizing reproduction for sea stars and sea urchins. And in his retirement, he started a wonderful organization called Limpet. He'll probably tell you a little bit about that also. But without further ado, let's get right into the sex lives of the tide pools with Dr. John Pearse, okay?
Okay, so, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I was a teacher on the faculty at UC Santa Cruz for over 20 years. I've been retired for over 20 years. So, but when I was teaching, I had courses in invertebrate zoology and intertidal biology and kelp forest ecology, and spent a lot of time in the intertidal. Since I retired, I spent a lot of time in the intertidal, mostly with high school students. And when Amity asked me to give this talk, I've given lots of talks about different, I have stories to tell. But I wasn't sure which one to talk about. And several years ago, I wrote a review of reproduction of animals in the intertidal, and for a big encyclopedia of intertidal. And I was really impressed when I put that together, realizing that in the intertidal, there's all kinds of modes of sex going on. It's really quite remarkable. You can see almost every kind of sex that you can imagine, and some that you never imagined. And so this picture here is a great tide pool in Pacific Grove. It's the great tide pool that Ed Ricketts spent quite a bit of time collecting in. In Cannery Row, he was immortalized. There's a chapter about the Great Tide Pool, and it looks. Look at that. It's just a bunch of boulders out there, but it is intertidal, and it's got almost all the things that I want to talk about right here in the intertidal. So, what I'd like to do is talk about sex, not necessarily reproduction. In fact, I'm not sure that reproduction has that much to do with sex. Sex is really, it's not reproduction, it's producing new creatures, new things by combining eggs and sperm or other kinds of gametes, but combining things to make a new creature. It's not a reproducing, it's making new things. Almost everything does it, and it seems to be one of the main things that everything wants to do, including us, right? We all want to have kids. And the kids are not us, they are new things, as we all know who have kids. So I'm going to start with animals that, let's see here, how do I, there we are, with these beautiful pictures that were taken by Rick Parsons, who's right here. Oystercatchers are really intertidal animals. They're found in the intertidal all around the world, different species. They feed on intertidal animals, limpets, crabs, snails, worms, almost everything that you can eat, they eat. Some places they even eat oysters, where there aren't oysters. They're very conspicuous animals. Anybody who's walking on the recreational trail in Pacific Grove is familiar with them. They're talking all the time with each other. They're quite social, and they're also very much homebodies. They're almost a model of what we would expect for people to be. They make partnerships. They live for the first 4 or 5 years. They live in groups of juveniles, and they get to know each other, talk to each other all the time, and eventually pair up and make pairs, which probably are pairs for life. I'm not sure we can say that for sure, but they seem to be pairs for life, and they set up housekeeping, setting up a territory where where the two of them protect fiercely from any other encroachment of other oyster catchers. So they're talking all the time to each other, and they're also talking to any other oyster catcher who gets near, or for that matter, crows or hawks or things that might threaten their kids. And these two here are talking to each other. The one on the right is a male, and that you can't really tell them apart. They are almost identical, excepting for the size of the pupil and the eye, or the shape of the pupil, which you can't see here. I mean, Rick's a very good photographer, and he's got pictures of them, but you can't see it here. But I know that's a male because that's what he was talking about. Oh, what did I do? I went the wrong way. I'm sorry. Who do I point this to get it to go? Did I turn it off?
You actually hit
There we are. Okay, I got it. Yeah. So that's what they're doing, and so they do this once in a while, probably only a few times each season, and as they're copulating and they are celebrating here, so that's what we all expect to do when we're doing sex, and the effect is also pretty effective. Is that yes? There's 2 eggs. And they set up the housekeeping with those eggs there, and they're really equal partners. Both of them will sit on the egg while the other one goes out to feed, and also the other one goes out to chase away any potential predator or competitor. They really want to keep their territory to themselves, because they're feeding on everything in their territory, depending on that food for raising that chick. And they hatch out, usually 2. So there's a perfect little homebodies with their 2 kids, just hatched, and they take care of those kids. They go out. One of them takes care of the kids and protects them, while the other one is out foraging, bringing food back, and feeding. Where is that? Is that? What am I doing here, which is wrong? There it is. So it's bringing in his food and giving it to the chick. So it's a very much of a thing that we can all identify with. It's what we would like all of us to be, something like this. Unfortunately, there's about 30 to 40 pairs on the Monterey Peninsula and Point Lobos. And for the last several years, there's been a very dedicated group of volunteers who've been following them and keeping track of them, and finding out that only about 1 in 10 of the pairs are successful in raising any fledgling in any 1 year. They live for about 15 years, so they have about 10 years, year after year, to produce chicks, and that gives them some chance of at least reproducing themselves, or producing new individuals during their lifespan. They're on the edge here. There are exceptions. For example, here at Point Lobos last year, there was a pair with 3 fledglings, which look like they got all the way through. Most of them lose they lose a lot of eggs, so they never even hatch. When the chicks are young, they're taken out by hawks, by raccoons, by cats, by dogs, by whatever. We really don't know. You go and you watch, and you're watching a pair with their chicks, come back the next morning, and their chicks are gone. And so it's up in the air. This is an exceptional one. We can see that the fledglings, there's 3 fledglings there. You can recognize them with the black tips on their beak. It takes about 1.5 years, 2 years before they completely become all red beaks. Then they can join other fledglings and get to know each other and do some sort of mate selection, just like we do. Okay, they don't go to bars, but they go to things together and get to know each other. Most birds which make pairs like this also aren't all that faithful. Sometimes they switch pairs, like penguins switch partners almost every season. These probably don't. We don't have enough information to know if they are really faithful for their whole life. And those that are faithful for their whole life, other birds have been checked for paternity and find out, sometimes they are getting little eggs from some other male besides their partner. So it's just like us, okay? Now, if we look at other things, crabs are quite social animals too. These crabs I took on the breakwater, and there they are busy working with each other, feeding. They feed on mostly on algae, and they're always interacting with each other. I had a couple of students at Santa Cruz who did a study where they built a kind of an artificial corral for crabs and built with blocks, a complex habitat for them, fed them, and then just watched them. And they found out that actually the males were very aggressive to each other, and constantly they're interacting with each other. The males would set up territories of cracks and crevices which they would then protect, and they would drive out other males and get very aggressive about it. On the other hand, females come up to the males, and the males would just say, "Welcome, you can come in and look at my place." And so there's quite a bit of interaction going on even with things like crabs. You might wonder, well, how do we tell males and females apart? Well, that's pretty easy if you turn them over. Crabs are just like shrimp and lobsters, but instead of having that meaty tail, the tail is turned up underneath them. And the male, you can see, has got a kind of a pointed part of that last part of the abdomen, while the female is big and broad. And if you look inside underneath there, you can see the male is pretty well equipped. Those are small modified legs, which are essentially are penises that the male has. And if you look at the female, she's got this big broad thing, and those 2 pores there are the vulvas of the female. So they're quite sexually dimorphic. There was a wonderful study done in the 40s by a Berkeley student who followed these crabs, and it really still is the definitive study on them. And he found that with the males, when they would get the females to come to them for mating, he would get on his back and she would jump on top of him, and they would do a mating process, and he would transfer sperm to her. So that's also pretty, it's a little different than what we do. If you're trying to handle 2 penises, it could be a challenge. And the eggs then are released and fertilized and released, and the female then holds those eggs for about 3 weeks. The eggs develop held in her, so that's why she has that big flap there, is to hold the eggs. those feathery things are modified legs, which are used for holding them. And then they hatch out and go to sea, and the larvae are in the sea for another 3 or 4 weeks before they find their way back. This is something that most crustaceans do. Most crustaceans have some kind of separate sexes, have eggs that they brood like this, take care of the eggs, and take care of them, and have thousands of eggs. Of those thousands of eggs that go to sea, if they're lucky, 1 or 2 can make it back in and grow up to a new one. So essentially it's the same kind of gamble that oystercatchers make. Oystercatchers take care of 2 eggs. These take care of thousands. They both expect maybe sometimes 1 or 2 reaching adulthood. Almost all do that, and if you look at a rock like this is covered with crustaceans too. You can't quite see them there. They're barnacles. And barnacles are essentially shrimp, which are standing on their head, cemented to the rock, encased in a shell, and their feet stick out from that opening there and filter water. And so they're feeding, but they're in one place. And you can think of, if they're crustaceans and they copulate, this could be a problem being in one place. It's hard to find a partner. And I think that they get around this by 3 different ways. One of them, as you can see here, they settle next to each other. They cluster very close to each other. And when they come in as larvae and are looking for a place to settle, what they're looking for is somebody who's already settled. And if they can't find anybody, they'll settle, and then they hope that others will come and find them and settle next to them. And this is what you see. Lots and lots of barnacles, almost always settled next to each other so that they can... the other thing that they do is if they're going to copulate and they can't move, they've got to have a long penis. The penis of these animals is enormous. It's a long worm-like thing. It's about the size of that quarter. About that quarter, they would go across that quarter. So sometimes when you go out on an early morning when it's damp, you can find barnacles copulating. You can find these little white worms that are kind of crawling around on top of the barnacles. Their penises looking for partners. And they have some, what's that? They have some reputation of having the biggest, longest penis for their size of any animal. The other thing that they do, which is a little unusual, is they're hermaphrodites. So they can copulate with anybody. That's not a 50-50 thing, and they can copulate. So they're copulating with each other all the time. This particular species is one that settles and within weeks is already mature, producing eggs and sperm, copulating, producing eggs. They're brooding inside the shell, and then releasing the eggs when they hatch to larvae. Other barnacles, which are bigger, like these pink barnacles, take about 3 years to get big enough to be mature. And make a lot of shell. They are preyed to protect them, and they live for something like 15 to 20 years. But they also have, just like, and up in the upper right-hand corner there are leaf barnacles, goose barnacles, which have the same kind of life. They're settling. Now, sometimes you find barnacles all by themselves, like this one here. And when you look inside them, they often have eggs, fertilized eggs, which they're brooding and getting ready to release. And then the question is, well, how do they get fertilized eggs if they don't have any partners anywhere? Well, one of the obvious things is they're hermaphrodites. They can do it to themselves. So it doesn't give you quite the same kind of new individual if you're mating with yourself, but at least you can mate with yourself. And that seemed to be the answer until people used DNA to do paternity and found out that no, the father was from somewhere else. And the possibility that maybe somewhere around that animal there was one which was destroyed. There's no evidence of that right there. But the other one is, more likely, is that here they are, they have the penis and they're reaching around and they're fertilizing others. They can also just let it go. Sperm just gets broadcast out into the ocean and gets swept away, and somebody like this is out picking up the sperm and catching it. So that's something which most marine animals actually do, and it's not unlikely that these do that too. There are other animals which are hermaphroditic, and their whole life, so they have both males and females. All nudibranchs are hermaphroditic, and they're if you go out in the intertidal, you know that finding nudibranchs is always an exciting thing to do because you don't find very many usually. So when you find them, there they are all by themselves. And I think the answer to when they have the same problem of finding somebody else. The best thing for them to be is hermaphroditic, so whoever they find, they can mate with. And things like this Hopkins rose will mate for hours together once they find each other, or sometime. I've never seen anything quite like this here with 4 of them together in a mating combo. You can see the pink eggs. These animals produce eggs and just leave the eggs on the rocks, or if you have them in your aquarium, they'll lay the eggs almost immediately in these spirals, and the larvae hatch out and go to sea. These animals feed on, you see on the lower side there, let's see, down in here, up in here, there's the food source for these animals. It gives them their color as well as their food. So they are not very much. On the other hand, one of the more beautiful animals we have here, the opalescent nudibranch Hermesenda, these feed on lots of different things. You can feed them on pieces of squid, pieces of fish, or they feed on each other. They feed on other nudibranchs. So that's a little tricky. If you are going to be a cannibal, you have to be pretty tricky about who you're going to mate with. And particularly, you have to make sure that your mate isn't going to eat you rather than accept you or give you sperm. And so they have a very elaborate kind of testing each other, keeping each other, and then when they mate within seconds, and then they're gone. Here they are. And here you can see on the eggs that they produce. So those are hermaphrodites. We also have other kinds of hermaphrodites, which are a little bit more complicated. These things here, these looks like little caps. They're called slipper snails, and they're living on top of turban snails. And what you can see here is that there's 2 of them, one on top of the other, a small one on top of the big one. And in this case, these are hermaphrodites, but they're sequential hermaphrodites. Those small ones on the top are males, and the ones below are females. And the small ones have a pretty long penis, and they copulate with the one below. These are animals which are sequential in the sense when they're small, they're males. When they're getting, the one in the middle there looks like it's just about big enough to turn into a female and crawl off and find itself its own snail to crawl onto. And so these are animals which are called sequential, going from male, and they're small. They have a lot of sperm. They can copulate with the female. When they get bigger, they can produce more eggs. And so there's a selection for being big and being able to produce lots and lots of eggs. They also take care of their babies underneath the shell. So that whole shell in there is underneath is a place where they can lay their eggs, protect their eggs, and then the eggs, in this case, the eggs grow all the way to juveniles and then crawl away. And so they crawl away, become males, find female. Often what you find, the really small ones are on snails looking for a female and then getting on the female. We have other kinds of hermaphrodites. These owl limpets, you can see that they're all scattered around here, but they're separate from each other. They, at nighttime, they're out grazing around, keeping all of this completely clear of algae, and then they hide away during the daytime if they can. They're one of their main predators are oystercatchers, actually. These are all females. These are females which were at one time little tiny males hiding in the mussels. So they, and they're somewhat of a challenge for me to understand. The males are hidden away in the mussels. You don't see them very often. And as they get bigger and get to a size of some of the smallest one in here, start to produce eggs. And switch and stop producing sperm. And so it's the same principle in a way as the slipper shells. The big animals can produce a lot of eggs. The small animals produce not so many sperm, but enough. I have a hard time with that because these animals are broadcasters, so that the males just release the sperm and the females also just release the eggs. And fertilization takes place in the ocean. So you'd think you'd want to have a lot of sperm there as well as a lot of eggs to make sure that they're fertilized. But at least you get a lot of eggs. Those little things in here, little limpets, those are other species of limpets which have separate sexes all their lives and release eggs and sperm and never get very much bigger. So you wonder what is pushing owl limpets to capitalize on this to become really big before they can produce enough eggs to take care of themselves. On the rocks here on the Pacific Grove side and the Monterey side, it's all this hard rock, and you can't really see where the limpets are. In Santa Cruz, in the Santa Cruz coast, it's a soft rock, and you can see much better what is sometimes called a farm. And in this case, this female here, she's been out cleaning off an area, pushing off all the mussels and making a farm for herself, which she can go out and graze on. You can see the grazing marks. Every night she goes out and she grazes on those rocks. And she also kicks off everything else, including all the other limpets, so that there's nothing there. It's a farm for her to get plenty of diatoms which she's feeding on. There's only a few that she goes out every night. Not only does she patrol and graze, she also goes out and patrols and makes sure that there's nobody else on her farm. No other snail, no other limpet. And there's a few. You can see right up in here, there's a couple of little limpets which are nestled down right in the middle of her farm. And you can imagine every night when she goes out and she gets to them and she's pushing at them, get off my farm. And they are really settled in there. That particular limpet makes a home scar that it gets really tight down into. And it probably is mostly to keep it from being knocked off by owl limpets. The other place where you can see on the owl limpet right there is a limpet that can't get pushed off of the top of the shell. But then if we go into more mundane things like just these turban snails, which are one of our most common animals here, they are all separate sexes. Males and females are in this group here. There's males and females. You can't tell them apart. They produce lots of sperm or eggs. They broadcast them out. They don't get very big. So they, Allison before was talking about abalones, and abalones had to get big enough to make lots of, these things never get as big as an abalone. They do just fine. So I have a lot of problems sometimes when people say, oh, if it's not big it's not going to be able to produce enough eggs to reproduce. Well, these do just fine. They're very small. On the other hand, you have another snail. This little whelk here is a very small snail, and they can be quite big. These are quite different than the turban snails. These are carnivores. They're feeding on barnacles. They're the main thing that take out the barnacles. They drill into the barnacles, and so they're why the barnacles don't live very long. They have separate sexes. They copulate. They store the sperm. The sperm is used to fertilize the eggs. The females then produce these egg cases. And she puts in the egg cases a number of fertilized eggs. Sometimes she puts in the fertilized eggs and unfertilized eggs. The unfertilized eggs are used for food for the fertilized eggs. When they hatch, they come out as little embryos, and then they start eating all these yolky, unfertilized eggs. Or in some species, all the eggs are fertilized, but the first one that hatches has a head start, can eat all its siblings. So you end up with just one coming out. So in this case, these don't have pelagic larvae at all. They just crawl out as little snails. So we have a lot of variation, and this is just a tip of the variation. I've only taken a few different groups to do this, but we have things like turban snails, which are like most of our marine animals, I think. I'm not sure. If we try to make a list of the different kinds of modes of sexual recombination. And then we have things like the owl limpet, which is a sequential hermaphrodite. We have our slipper snails. So we have a lot of variation. And one of the things which is a challenge, I think, to evolutionary biologists, invertebrate biologists, to try to understand how can you have so many different variations. There ought to be something which is optimum, but we don't seem to have that. We have a whole bunch of variation. One more example are these little linerine snails that are very common along our coast here. If you walk along the intertidal in the high zone, you'll see these things sitting there, often, as the arrow points out, in pairs. These little snails live way up high, and they are in an area which only gets splashed during the high tide a few times a month, so that they're waiting for the splash to hit them. And they're waiting. They don't have much time when they're waiting to graze. They're grazing on the rocks, and also to have sex. So they often pair up. And so what you see them often are these male-female pairs. They're waiting for the splash in the water. Then they have to decide they're going to go out and graze, or they're going to have a little sex. The females will then produce egg cases, which are thrown out to sea, and they have pelagic larvae to come back in. But the main thing I wanted to point out on this thing is the black stuff on the top, the bacteria, the cyanobacteria. I don't know how many of you notice when you're walking along on the coast here, you'll see a band of black, and then underneath that it's more clear whitish rock. The whitish rock is white because these snails have cleared off all that cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria, on the other hand, is living way up at the top, and it's I think it's really interesting in the context of this talk. Here's a photograph of them under a microscope. They're just little filaments. These have been living on the Earth for about 3 billion years. A long time, several billion years, or before animals were even here. They were here. And you can imagine before you had any of the animals here to graze on them, the rocks were all black, covered with cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, as far as we know, don't do sex at all. So do you need sex? I mean, these animals don't, or no, they're not animals, they're bacteria, but they just grow. Just grow, fragment, and have been doing that for billions of years, which is pretty remarkable. And it does, to me, bring up a question. We still don't understand why we have to make new individuals rather than just replicate. So what do we have regarding sex in the sea? We have a lot of different variation. Separate sexes, hermaphrodites that are simultaneous or sequential, and I didn't have examples where in some cases the males are the second stage. So we have that as well, or no sex at all. No sex at all, which brings me to another kind of way in which people talk about reproduction, which I'm going to argue is not reproduction either. And that's with these anemones. We have three really common species of anemones here on this coast. On the left is the sunburst anemone, which is it's a southern species. It's found in Baja all the way up to central California. In the last decade or so, it started to appear in Sonoma. It's now, I think, as far as Mendocino. It's a southern species which seems to be moving north as we have warmer temperatures or currents bringing things up. The giant green, on the other hand, is a northern species which goes from Alaska down to Point Conception. And then farther south from that, you only find it in areas which you have cold upwelling around. So they seem to be really true to the temperature of the ocean. And the aggregating anemone is found from Alaska to southern Baja California. So they're all the way across, all three. And as you can see, the two, sunburst and the giant green, are those are full-grown animals. Those are big animals, right? And the aggregating anemones have small clones. On the other hand, those clones are formed by dividing. They just divide and divide. So essentially, they're doing what blue-green algae are doing. They're just dividing and dividing, and they're just growing. And I'd like to think that they're growing, and you can maybe say that the clonal one over here, this thing here, is as big as these two. Each one of these is a single animal, and they all have separate sexes. They all broadcast their eggs and sperm. So I don't know, you'd have to open it up and look at it. But each one of those is either a male or a female. So and that includes the aggregating animal here. That's one big male or one big female. They're free spawning. They spawn out the eggs and sperm, fertilize in the ocean, drift around as little larvae, and then settle. So one other thing, also, like oyster catchers, they're very territorial, particularly the sunburst anemones. These animals, let's see, maybe I'll just go back for a minute. They don't fight among themselves, the different species, but they fight among themselves, just like oyster catchers, actually. So that when the tentacles here, the little thin tentacles are used for feeding. If the tentacle touches a tentacle of another animal over there, they recognize that this is not them. And that gets them all agitated, and these fighting tentacles appear. They just kind of get blown up. They're full of stinging cells. They start stinging each other. If they don't get up, and they can move slowly or hard, and they'll move apart. If they don't, if you keep them in a container together, they'll fight until one of them dies. So they're not just little pretty things. They're also real animals which are interacting with each other a lot. The same thing is true with aggregating anemones. Here's two clones. One of them is green, and the other one is smaller animals, and they're less green. And you can see there's a borderline between the two, and they're constantly fighting with each other when they get next to each other. Here's a cement block on on San Carlos Beach that I saw and found, and I was really taken by. And there's 2 clones here, and you can see a line right down the middle there that separates the 2. So that's sort of the no man's land. And actually, there's been quite a bit of some study on these things. The ones that are right in the edge of the clone there are fighting with each other and spend a lot of energy fighting with each other. The ones in the middle, there's no reason to fight, right? So what do? They make gametes. They're actually combining together. But that animal there is, that clone, particularly on one on the left, that's huge. That's much bigger than any of the big solitary ones. So it's a good way to get big if you want to do it. And just at the very end here, I want to mention also something that has been a thing with my wife and I for 40 years, I guess, maybe 50. And that is that people like to say that green anemone there is green because it has algae in it. Actually, that's not true. All of them have algae. They all have algae. The algae are symbionts, and the algae are producing sugars, glycerol for them as nutrients. They are protecting the algae. The algae are golden brown, and if you look at the right in the middle in here, that's the color of the algae here. The pigments, the green pigments that they all have, different amounts, is all made from, it's a green fluorescent protein that is made by the animals themselves. I don't know how many of you saw Ben Veneman's talk earlier today. He was all about medical things, and people now use green fluorescent pigment to mark proteins. It's the same pigment. And each of these animals, species here, have slightly different proteins to give them the color. So the color of the giant green is a slightly different green fluorescent pigment than the one that's in the sunburst anemone. Sometimes, particularly in the sunburst anemone, in fact, as far as I know, only in the sunburst anemone, they produce a green fluorescent pigment which is much, much brighter. Here you can see in the pool, the green fluorescent pigment is in this one fluorescent or neon or whatever you want to call it anemone, and it's surrounded by the more normal kinds of anemones. Just this year, there's a student at Hopkins working with a researcher at Scripps, and they're starting to look at this green fluorescent pigment. This is a very bright green fluorescent pigment because it has just a few amino acids different than the other ones. I've been following some of these for almost 2 decades. You can find them, go back to the same one. They're just beautiful animals. I just want to try to get as many people to understand that green pigment is animal. It's not have anything to do with the algae at all. Okay. Thanks very much. Any questions if you want? Yes.
Have you seen changes with climate warming?
Have I seen what?
Changes in these intertidal areas with the climate change?
The southern species of anemone. The southern species of anemone. The question is, have I seen changes in the intertidal? And actually, not as many as I thought I might. One of the things that we have seen is many, many, many more of the sunburst anemones here in the intertidal. And we're working with people at Bodega who are starting to document their increase there. So they're one that's coming up. Another one is the pink volcano barnacle. That's a southern species. And Hopkins rose is a southern species. And they're now more common than they used to be. So there are some things that are changing, but not as dramatic as we might expect. At least I thought that there'd be more. We've been doing some studies, which I'm still doing with high school kids, monitoring the same sites for 45 years. And there's been very little change, which is quite remarkable.
How about the temperature, the pH, and
Temperature has gone up and then went back down, and so it's going up. There is a study that was done, a very famous study now, that was one of the very first studies of the intertidal documenting things was done in the 30s at Hopkins. And what the person did is he just did a transect right across the intertidal and just counted everything in there. That was repeated in the 90s. And many of the southern species were much more, or some of the southern species which he hadn't seen before were now there. And some of the northern species were decreased. And that was quite exciting, and it got a paper published in Science. But then since that time, for the last almost 10, 15 years, the temperatures stabilized or even gone down. And some of these things have changed back down to more earlier things. It's gone down because there's been more upwelling, because there's been more storms, because there's been more global warming. So it's, it gets really complicated really fast. That's something, that's a project that I'm involved with right now at Hopkins. Since I retired, I've moved back here and live right by Hopkins and I work with Hopkins a lot. And Hopkins they've been there for over 100 years. They've had people working there for over 100 years. Almost all of them are students who maybe work for 4 years, get their PhD and get the hell out of there. And then that study just sits there, right? So we don't have a very good record of how things have changed over time. And right now we're in a project of going back to those old studies and trying to see, well, how have things changed over time? Even Ricketts had terrific notes, and we're starting to look at those notes to see what did he see and what we seem to be seeing now is things go like that all the time, and it's going to be very hard to get a track. We've been interviewing people who were classmates of mine actually in the 50s and 60s, trying to get their impression of what it was like then to compare it with what it's like now. And everybody says, oh, it was just spectacular. I'm not sure what that really means. Most of them, like I came from the University of Chicago and then Arizona, and ended up over here. Well, it was just stunning, right? Now I think, well, I don't know. I've been here so long, maybe I'm just jaded. So it's really hard to know how much change has been. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
John, can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on the sea star in intertidal and have they been able to make a recovery from what we know is the sea star wasting disease?
Sea star wasting disease?
Yeah, and how
After I gave you this title, because I was just starting, I thought, this could be an interesting, fun thing to talk about. I don't know if it was or not. But anyway, I thought I should have been talking about the sea star wasting disease. That's what everybody's interested in. We don't know what's going on with the sea star wasting disease. It's not new. It has occurred not as extensive as it is now, or in 2013. But our Limpets program detected that going down before the sea star wasting disease. So it wasn't just bingo like people make it out to be. For some things it was. For sunflower star, they just disappeared all of a sudden. But other things, the intertidal things have been going down. The stars at Hopkins, we have records that go back to the 50s, and it just goes like this. It's been a very slow decline until about 2009, and then it went way down. It's site-specific. If you go to the breakwater here, there's lots of really big stars. They never really got hit. And at the same time, you go to Hopkins, and they're all gone. That's a mile away. So it's very hard to generalize about what's happening. There's a virus was identified that's been associated with them. That virus is found in all the stars. So it doesn't really tell you that virus is the cause. We did have the blob we're talking about, which unusually warm temperatures. But, you know, it went all the way to Alaska. Well, Alaska is not warm, even when it's warm. So it's maybe it's a relative temperature thing. It's very hard to know. But I think the difference is this time people noticed and really got onto it. And we had monitoring programs which have been monitoring by Limpets, by our high school students, by UCSC, by Santa Barbara. There's a whole bunch of monitoring programs that have been going on for the last 15 years. They were ready for this, and all of a sudden they had something to talk about because things changed. And so I think we're really in a good place now for that. I don't know if we're going to figure it out. Anybody else?
Impact of the sewage spill on the tidal.
What's that?
Is there an impact from the sewage spills on the tidal?
Is there?
Sewage spills? Impact of sewage spills on the tidal?
Oh, that big sewage spill? Yeah. You know, I don't think that that's big enough to do that. I mean, it was swept away pretty quickly. One of the things that we did at Santa Cruz, when I first got there, they were dumping all around the bay in the 70s. All of our sewage was just dumped into the Intertidal at Point Pinos and Carmel Bay and in Santa Cruz. And in Santa Cruz, we started to study a site there, which was in the middle of a sewage disposal area. Everything was killed excepting for a few species of algae. Who did just fine. I mean, so then you sort of, well, what do you like? Do you like surf grass or do you like the coral and algae? Coral and algae loved it. Surf grass were all killed. And we, with my students and then with the high school students since I retired, have been following that site throughout that time for the last 45 years. It took about 25 years for that to recover, but now it's recovered pretty well. And yeah, we published that in the sanctuary publication a couple of years ago. But I don't think that this sewage is going to have a huge impact. Okay, nobody else wants to talk about sex?